Welcome to this session, which has probably the sexiest sounding title of any on this conference. My name is Bob McMahon. I'm an emeritus professor at Ohio State, and I'll begin by briefly giving some biography, introduction to each of the three panelists, and they'll each speak for somewhere between 15 to 20 minutes, and if I'll follow that with some brief comments, and then if all goes well, we'll have a good 30 minutes or so for questions from the audience. So to my far left is Michelle Parazzino, who's an assistant professor of strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College. She received her PhD from the University of Texas. She is the author of The Cuban Missile Crisis and the United States, A Short History with Documents, which came out in 2018. She's published articles and book chapters in some high-profile places, including the journals The International History Review and the Journal of Cold War Studies. And she's currently working on a book manuscript called Reagan's War on Drugs, From the Cold War to the War on Terror. And next to her is Silke Zoller, who's originally from Germany, earned her MA in Germany, and then moved to the U.S. and received her PhD at Temple University. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas, or she was, and she was just recently, and now is an assistant professor of history at Kennesaw State University. She's the author of the book To Deter and Punish: Global Collaboration Against Terrorism in the 1970s, which was published 2 years ago by Columbia University Press. And Matthew Frakes is currently a postdoc fellow at the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia, and before that received master's degrees from the London School of Economics as well as Columbia University. So I'll now turn it over to the panelists. And have you decided who wants to go first? Should we just go by
the order
program?
Yeah.
Okay.
Program's fine. All right. Well, great. Thank you so much. So my presentation this morning is titled Misfits, Looney Tunes, and Squalid Criminals, Reagan and the Rise of Rogue States. Now, we've all heard over the course of the past few days, and we all know how central the Cold War was to Ronald Reagan's presidency and how central Ronald Reagan was to the ending of the Cold War. And indeed, conventional scholarly wisdom holds that President Reagan's foreign policy and national security strategy were so focused on the Cold War that they provided, in the words of one prominent historian, quote, little useful guidance for future policymakers facing a dramatically altered international situation in the decades after the end of the Cold War. By contrast, my research argues that Reagan's impact and vision extended beyond the fall of communism to the shaping of the new global order that followed, and the development of strategies that would guide America's approach to global security for the coming decades. As the bipolar Cold War order began to fracture and collapse in the second half of the 1980s, it wasn't yet clear what would come to replace anti-communism and the containment of Soviet power as the defining framework or the animating force behind America's role in the world. Now, over a series of crises over the course of Reagan's presidency, Reagan and his national security team increasingly recognized the rising importance of newly emerging security threats, including state-sponsored terrorism, unpredictable military aggression, the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, and narcotics trafficking, and the convergence of these threats into a single growing phenomenon that they called outlaw states, renegade regimes, and eventually rogue states. Now, my research traces the formation and evolution of the idea of rogue states over the course of the Reagan presidency as a new framework on which to build U.S. national security as the Cold War was winding down. Libya, Panama, and Iraq all emerged as the first poster children for this new phenomenon, and each contributed different characteristics to the new challenge taking shape. As Reagan and his team grappled with how to confront this new security threat, the strategies they fashioned, as well as their debates and their disagreements over military intervention, regime change, negotiations, laid the groundwork and set critical precedents for future crises in the post-Cold War era, especially the later War on Terror. Reagan made clear his disdain for the emerging threat of rogue states in his July 1985 speech to the American Bar Association, advocating a more proactive strategy to combat state-sponsored terrorism. He vowed that the U.S. would not tolerate, quote, attacks from outlaw states run by the strangest collection of misfits, Looney Tunes, and squalid criminals since the advent of the Third Reich. Now, chief among these outlaw states in his sights was Colonel Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, who Reagan called the mad clown of Tripoli. Gaddafi emerged as the first poster child for the rogue state phenomenon, and he fused this emerging concept with the growing threat of state-sponsored terrorism. Gaddafi had been a thorn in Reagan's side from the very beginning of his presidency, sparking a mix of conventional military confrontations and increasingly violent and wide-ranging terrorist attacks. In the face of this challenge, the Reagan administration crafted an escalating strategy of integrated diplomatic, economic, and military actions that all culminated in airstrikes against Gaddafi's regime in April 1986, known as Operation El Dorado Canyon. And this marked the culmination of the first comprehensive counterterrorism strategy in American history aimed at state sponsors of terrorism, and it set a precedent for the use of military force against the state sponsors of terrorism with the ultimate goal of regime change. Now, El Dorado Canyon was the most famous moment in Reagan's running conflict with Gaddafi, but in the final months of Reagan's presidency, Gaddafi returned to foment three more crises that underscored the three central features that were coming to define rogue states: the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, sponsorship of terrorism, and unpredictable military aggression. Now, first, in the fall of 1988, toward the end of Reagan's second term, U.S. intelligence reports began picking up word that Gaddafi was in the process of completing construction of the largest chemical weapons factory in the developing world at a place called Rabta, just south of Tripoli, and that he would soon possess stockpiles of these weapons of mass destruction. And Reagan wrote in his diary of the high stakes with which he viewed the crisis, saying that he felt the Rabta plant threatens the entire Middle East. But his administration was rebuffed in its efforts to enlist international cooperation from Europe and Japan to cut off the technology and supplies necessary to make chemical weapons. And so instead, Reagan requested his Joint Chiefs of Staff to draw up top-secret military plans to destroy the Rabta plant, though he ultimately decided against this course of action. At the same time, a far more destructive tragedy occurred when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded in the evening sky over Lockerbie, Scotland on December 21st, 1988. The Lockerbie bombing was one of the world's most lethal acts of international terrorism prior to 9/11, and it caught the U.S. in the transition between administrations, which effectively stymied any decisive response. And moreover, it was 2 years before the investigation of the Lockerbie bombing pointed definitively back to Gaddafi, by which time the Bush administration opted to treat it as a matter for criminal law enforcement rather than undertake retaliatory military strikes. Now, the third and final confrontation between Reagan and Gaddafi came only 2 weeks before the end of Reagan's time in office, with an air battle between two Libyan jets and two American aircraft operating off of the USS John F. Kennedy in the Mediterranean on January 4th, 1989, in which both Libyan jets were shot down, mirroring a very similar incident from 7.5 years earlier over the Gulf of Sidra. Now, this pointed to yet another central aspect of rogue state behavior, unpredictable armed aggression. With no rational hope of winning and no obvious objective, Gaddafi's final assault underscored the unpredictable and erratic decision-making that had come to characterize his rule. Now, Reagan's next adversary stretched the emerging mold of rogue states in new ways. At first glance, Panama and the regime of General Manuel Noriega appeared quite distinct from Libya and from Iraq. Yet, it played a significant role in the short period from 1988 to 1990 in expanding this emerging rogue state paradigm, linking it with the parallel international issue of narcotics trafficking, and adding an explicit criminal dimension to the public image of rogue dictators. On February 4th, 1988, two federal grand juries in Florida handed down indictments against Noriega for drug trafficking and racketeering. Now, these indictments were largely symbolic because the U.S. had no extradition treaty with Panama and therefore no legal jurisdiction or means to bring Noriega back to the U.S. for trial. And in addition, these indictments were not planned or authorized by the top tier of the Reagan administration, so it put them in a bit of a fix. On one hand, they couldn't be seen as soft on drug traffickers, but on the other hand, they had to scramble to figure out how to follow up on this significant escalation in the standoff with Panama. So on March 10th, Reagan convened his national security team and made his first critical major strategic decision in how to set his administration's course for dealing with this crisis. He decided to set the overall strategic objective of regime change. As he wrote after the meeting, "We must get rid of him." Now, in this, Reagan had the full support of his national security team, but soon after, a fierce debate broke out over how to accomplish this overall objective of removing Noriega from power. It quickly became clear that economic sanctions alone would not do the trick. And so Secretary of State George Shultz took the initiative with a diplomatic plan to accomplish the goal of regime change without having to resort to military force. So in mid-April, Shultz, with Reagan's approval, sent a special envoy to Panama to deal with Noriega directly. And the envoy reported back that Noriega was willing to discuss his departure, thanks to American pressure, but only if the U.S. dropped its indictments against him. Now, Reagan initially resisted this concession, but he decided to reverse course in early May with Shultz's support in order to spur a breakthrough in the languishing negotiations, concluding that this was the only option short of using military force. Now, at this point, the deal to dismantle the Noriega regime came together rapidly. But at the same time, word leaked out to the press, and a firestorm opened on the home front. Reagan received a letter from Congress before the day was out, signed by 70 congressmen expressing their complete opposition to the proposed deal. And with this change in political headwinds came the sparking of a battle royale among Reagan's national security team over whether to move ahead with the proposed deal. Vice President George Bush, who had just secured that year's Republican presidential nomination, led the charge in the opposition against Reagan in this, which was a very rare thing. And he argued publicly, quote, "I won't bargain with terrorists, and I won't bargain with drug dealers either." So what Reagan called a division of ranks formed among the top tier of his advisors. And in this, President Reagan was the one who displayed the clearest grasp of the alternatives on the table. Because if he were to hold firm on his decision to oust the Noriega regime, he reasoned, he now had only two options left on the table, to either broker a deal or to use military force. Otherwise, he would have to leave Noriega in place. So after acrimonious debate, Reagan made the final decision to go ahead with the deal. Noriega would step down and leave Panama, at which time the U.S. would drop its indictments against him. Now in this, Reagan keenly felt his isolation. As he wrote, "I was practically alone with just George Shultz and Colin Powell's support. Quote, "Even Nancy is against me on this one, but I'm absolutely convinced it's the only way to go." Unfortunately, soon afterward, Noriega reneged and the deal collapsed. Reagan and Shultz agreed to pull the plug. But even though this attempt at regime change in Panama came to naught, it revealed much about the emerging debates and priorities within the US government over how to deal with rogue dictators. Reagan's final rogue adversary was Saddam Hussein of Iraq, who of course would soon become the quintessential rogue state. Saddam's regime shared all of the emerging qualities of rogue states: state sponsorship of terrorism, unpredictable military aggression, but he most memorably fused the emerging rogue state paradigm with the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. Reagan clearly recognized Saddam's dangerous qualities from the very beginning of his time in office. After Israel's destruction of Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981, Reagan called Saddam a no-good nut and condemned him for trying to build nuclear weapons and for his repeated military aggression. But Reagan had to temper his recognition of the danger of Saddam's regime with the need to combat what he considered higher priority threats to American interests in the Middle East, namely Soviet and especially Iranian expansion, and therefore the need to support Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war in order to maintain a delicate balance of power between these two unsavory regimes. But the issue, more than any other, that led the Reagan administration to detect dangerous and menacing patterns in the behavior of the Iraqi regime was its use of chemical weapons, which became a recurring part, according to US intelligence reports, a recurring part of Iraq's battlefield strategy by the middle of the decade. It was Shultz who led the charge to curb the production and use of chemical weapons, but he faced stiff opposition both within the Reagan administration as well as among America's European allies against this, and therefore Reagan and his team faced limited options and competing priorities as they sought to prevent an Iranian victory and therefore decided for the time being to contain the issue of chemical weapons. But as reports of Iraq's chemical weapons use multiplied in the second half of the decade, American patience began to wear thin. With the end of the Iran-Iraq War in August 1988, there was no longer the need to balance the competing priorities of condemning chemical weapons use while preventing an Iranian victory. And moreover, Saddam wasted little time in unleashing a new round of chemical weapons attacks to repress his rebellious Kurdish population in northern Iraq, unleashing the largest chemical weapons attack on civilians in history in the city of Halabja in March 1988, and then unleashing a new round just after the ceasefire with Iran to crush the remaining Kurdish resistance. Shultz's State Department denounced the attacks, but without the support of allies, even the Reagan administration would only go so far. But a growing tide of opinion, particularly within the State Department, was beginning to believe that the end of the Iran-Iraq war should warrant a change toward a firmer and more confrontational approach toward Iraq. Shultz wrote that he felt Iraq had become one of the, quote, enemy states of the responsible world community by this point. But with the Reagan administration's time at the helm of US foreign policy drawing to a close, Shultz and his like-minded advisors didn't communicate their changing views clearly or forcefully enough to their successors for the Bush administration to change course. So in conclusion, the story of Reagan's foreign policy and national security strategy in the 1980s is as much about a beginning as an ending, not just about the ending of the Cold War, but also the building of a new global order. Reagan and his team recognized new security challenges and threats that would come to define the New World Order after the Cold War, as they were still in the process of emerging, adapting to them, improvising, crafting and debating new strategies to address them. Reagan was deeply involved in this process of reorienting US national security strategy from its Cold War focus on anti-communism to a new framework of enforcing global norms against rogue states. Reagan left this process incomplete, but his evolving strategies laid the groundwork and set precedents that would guide his successors through the war on terror yet to come.
Okay, so thank you to you all for being here today. Thank you to Michelle and Matt for being on this panel, to Dr. McMahon for chairing it. So what I'm presenting today is part of a very early stage project. So please excuse the somewhat rough edges that I'm about to present, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. So on June 28th, 1985, Ronald Reagan is in Chicago, Illinois. He's about to give a speech on his tax reform, and he starts the speech with a warning about international terrorism. He says, and I quote, "This barbarism is abhorrent, and all of those who support it, encourage it, and profit from it are abhorrent. They are barbarians." And the thing that he's really concerned with is state sponsors of terrorism. Now, the states that at this point the Reagan administration is primarily identifying as terrorism sponsors are places like Libya, Syria, Nicaragua, Iraq, Iran, and they're all states that have gone through revolutionary upheavals in the past decades. So initially, when Reagan comes into office, he has these Cold War priorities. He's really about going after the Soviet Union for sponsoring terrorism. But within a very short time, his administration shifts focus to decolonized states who, according to Reagan, are not adhering to the rules of civilized society. So that term of civilization versus barbarism is something that is very important to him. And the problem is that these rogue states are not just a threat, but there are very concrete examples of them being able to influence the United States. And of course, the most clear example of this is the Iran hostage crisis from 1979 to 1981. So Reagan campaigns on the back of this crisis. He's well aware that his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, probably lost his presidential bid because of this crisis. So what I'm interested in is how does Reagan's awareness of the Iran hostage crisis shape his counterterrorism policies moving forward? How does he react to situations where so-called rogue states appear to have an outsized influence towards the US government? Now, international terrorism at this point has been an issue for about 14 years. By the late 70s, it has become a talking point for conservatives who, as part of sort of a conservative wave of reasserting American strength, are all about punishing international terrorists. But once again, when they're talking about it, they're really very focused on state sponsors of terrorism. It's sort of hard for a lot of conservatives to wrap their head around the idea that terrorist groups would be operating independently of a state sponsor. So overall, the Iran hostage crisis comes about, and it seems to confirm all the things that conservatives are worried about. So in November 1979, students stormed the embassy in Tehran. They take 66 American hostages. 52 of them will remain hostage for 444 days. And the burgeoning Iranian theocratic state quickly sort of takes control of the hostages, actively engages and prolongs in this act of hostage-taking. And so this provides a concrete example of how state sponsorship of terrorism can cripple the United States, right? So Jimmy Carter announces that he's not going to travel while the crisis is ongoing. Initially, Americans rally around the president, so his approval ratings shoot up. Yet at the same time, the US public is viewing constant news reports on the crisis. So there's a nightly news segment, America Held Hostage. There's a lot of emotional support for the hostages. There's a lot of cry for action. And yet Carter is not able to negotiate. He's not able to secure the hostages' release. So as the weeks turn into months, this becomes a problem because it gives the impression that Carter himself is crippled by the crisis. So his poll numbers begin sliding right as he enters an election year. By April 1980, another round of negotiations has failed, and he decides, okay, we're going to do a military operation, Operation Eagle Claw, which also fails badly. It kills 8 US servicemen, never really gets off the ground. So Carter's poll numbers drop again. By April 1980, his approval rating is at 21%, which is lower than Richard Nixon's approval in the days right before Nixon's resignation. It's incredibly low. So when Reagan is campaigning for the US president, he is to a significant part running against Carter's handling of the Iran crisis. So Reagan and his campaign in the fall of 1980 are projecting an image of toughness against terrorism in general and state sponsors, especially Iran in particular. And it does win him the election. But then once the Reagan administration is in office, the administration winds up taking a more nuanced stance on terrorism and terrorist sponsors than they had originally announced. So initially, there's a lot of tie-in to the Soviet Union, but it very quickly becomes clear, like the Soviet Union is too powerful, and Reagan is not going to risk a nuclear confrontation over accusations that the Soviets are sponsoring terrorism. He's just not going to do it. So instead, he winds up going against states on the one hand, but also organized groups, terrorist groups, militia groups, insurgent groups that are conducting terrorism, but that are also friendly towards the Soviet Union. So there is very much a pattern of, if you are friendly towards the Soviets, you are very likely to be labeled a terrorist by the Reagan administration. So these entities are lower hanging fruit than the Soviets are, so to say. But even against these sort of weaker entities, what we see is that the danger that there might be another hostage crisis sometimes helps stay the administration's hand. So as you mentioned, in 1981, Reagan starts a series of escalatory measures against Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. And yet, for example, in December 1981, there's a meeting, and Reagan's first Secretary of State, Al Haig, points out that there are still about 1,500 Americans living in Libya, and that they need to be out of Libya before the next round of escalations can continue. Otherwise, Gaddafi can take them hostage. So Reagan orders Americans to leave Libya. He puts restrictions on that you're not really allowed to travel to Libya on a US passport in the future. And then there's a gap of a couple of months to give the Americans enough time to leave. So there is a sort of moderating influence because this hostage crisis has only just passed. And the threat of a Libyan hostage-taking proves to be a very real danger. So, for example, in 1984, the United Kingdom breaks diplomatic relations with Libya, and Gaddafi has 5 British citizens in Libya arrested and winds up holding them hostage for almost 9 months. Similarly, we start seeing US hostages being taken in Lebanon. And again, here, Reagan is sort of moderating his stance this time because the Iran hostage crisis was this huge media spectacle, right? And Reagan doesn't really have the capacity to free these hostages immediately. So what you see is that they almost disappear from public statements. He's very careful not to talk about them because he doesn't want that media exposure. He's personally very concerned, but everybody is sort of working underneath the table to try to free these hostages. And while these types of events preoccupy the Reagan administration, they don't reach sort of the all-encompassing levels of the Iran hostage crisis. But in the summer of 1985, the hijacking of TWA Flight 847 does. So the hijacking happens on June 14th, 1985. 2 members of the Lebanese group Hezbollah hijacked the plane right after a stopover in Athens, Greece. And the hijackers are actually making demands of Israel. They want Israel to release 735 detainees that Israel has moved from Lebanon, these are Lebanese Shiites mostly, to Atlet prison in Israel, which is a violation of international law. You're not supposed to remove detainees from unoccupied territory. And so what happens in the next 2 days is a little bit complicated. If I were to just describe it, we'd be here for another half hour. So bear with me, the short version of what happens in the next 2 days. So the hijackers fly the plane back and forth from Beirut to Algiers twice. In different stages, they release some hostages. One hostage, a US Navy petty officer, is killed. And then there's a second Shiite militia group that becomes involved, Amal. And overall, 10 more hostage takers from Hezbollah and Amal enter the plane. At the same time, they remove 12 hostages from the plane and hide them in Beirut. These are men who either have Jewish-sounding names or have US military identification documents on them. So overall, on June 16th, The plane is back in Beirut for the third time. There are 33 hostages, men left on the plane. There are 12 hostages hidden somewhere in Beirut. There are now at least 2 militia groups involved, Hezbollah and Amal. And on June 16th, the Amal leader, Nabi Berri, takes control of the hijacking. So he announces that he is going to negotiate on behalf of the hijackers. Berri, however, does not really have control over the situation. So, for example, the 12 hostages hidden in Beirut are under Hezbollah control. I'm just laying the groundwork to let you know this is a pretty complex situation. There are a lot of actors and moving pieces involved. And the problem for the Reagan administration is that the options from the beginning of the hijacking are very, very limited. And that's in large part because the administration decides they're not going to repeat the mistakes that Carter made. And that is going to constrain what Reagan can do. So from the beginning, there's a very rare show of consensus from Secretary of State George Shultz, from Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, and National Security Advisor Bud McFarlane. They all agree you have to go through business as normal. You cannot do what Carter did and say that this is an extraordinary situation. So in the next days, Reagan meets with Congress about his tax plan. He travels, he gives speeches about his tax reform, very empathetically projecting, okay, life is moving on as usual. In addition, Reagan and his advisors decide they're not going to make large public concessions. They're not going to give the impression that they're eager to negotiate. Because since before his election, Reagan has projected an image of himself as the tough guy. He will not negotiate with terrorists. Now, in practice, he hasn't really upheld that image, but the idea is, okay, let's try to keep that, at least in the public, for as long as possible. So it's not really easy to make like large public concessions for the administration. And at the same time, a military rescue is sort of out of the picture. So the generals tell Reagan very quickly, Beirut is really unstable. We cannot send our military in. So the Reagan administration, the members go before the press and they tell the American people, don't expect a military rescue. Hostages are going to die if we do this, so we're not going to do it. But it's not just about making sure that hostages are not killed. It's also about avoiding a similarity to Operation Eagle Claw. So giving the idea that the U.S. is militarily impotent, that it can't even face off against these much weaker militia groups in Lebanon. And so the problem is then that you've sort of cut off a lot of avenues. You can't really threaten military retaliation. You can't make public gestures, at least. And so what do? The hijackers' request continues to be that Israel release these prisoners, but the Israelis very quickly say, well, we're going to need a formal U.S. request to do that. And Reagan is furious because that means the U.S. is going to have to give in to terrorism demands, is how he frames it. So he refuses on that. He says, no, we can't do that. You've created an artificial linkage between the two groups. That means we cannot ask Israel to do this. So the result is that Reagan, like Carter, really only has the option of conducting back-channel negotiations out of the public eye in order to convince the other actors to sort of move from their absolute positions. So he opens discussions with Berri, various discussions, back-channel discussions with the Israelis start. The Reagan administration also reaches out to Hafez Assad, Syria's ruler, because Syria is very closely involved with Amal. And Assad, in turn, reaches out to Hashemi Rafsanjani, the Iranian parliamentary speaker, because Iran is very close to Hezbollah. So behind the scenes, Reagan and his advisors are promising that if the hostages are released, they are going to push the Israelis to release the detainees at Atlet. But in public, Reagan continues to deny this linkage. But of course, these are discussions that take time. It takes time to set up these contacts. In the meantime, the hijackers know the sort of media engagement they can make. So they are very actively inviting journalists out to the tarmac at Beirut Airport to speak, for example, to the pilot of the plane, to speak to hostages. They trot hostages before the press in order to create this media spectacle similar to the Iranian hostage crisis and to place pressure on Reagan. And Reagan and his men, his officials, they know this. They are, throughout the crisis, constantly obsessed with poll numbers. So 5 days after the crisis, for example, Bud McFarlane gets a memo from his staff, which points out that, like during the Iran hostage crisis, right now there's an upsurge in popular support for the Reagan administration. But the memo also points out that Carter, and I quote, Carter dropped from 77 approval to only 43 approval in the first 4 months of the Iran hostage crisis. And the public opinion pattern developing now is similar to that found during the Iran hostage crisis. 3 days later, White House Chief of Staff Don Reagan gets a very similar memo, which warns that because the Reagan administration is starting off from a lower overall approval rating, their approvals are going to drop more quickly. So there's a constant sort of side eye towards the poll numbers, like how much time do we have until this situation just collapses and everybody says, oh, Reagan is just like Carter. And overall, Reagan finally loses his patience. He loses his nerve about 10 days into the hijacking. So on June 24th, Reagan decides he's going to cancel his upcoming 4th of July trip to his ranch in California over the objections of Schultz, of Weinberger, and McFarlane. And there's a huge conversation that breaks out among them that day about the danger of Carter syndrome and about the fact that it's been 10 days and the similarities to the Iran hostage crisis are too much. And the press is pointing this out as well. There are New York Times articles that are very clearly, for example, drawing that connection. On June 24th, Reagan and his advisors decide, okay, if we're going to be different, we need to put military options back on the table. So the next day they meet again, June 25th. They set up an escalation plan that includes a span of about 2 weeks. It starts with closing Beirut airport, goes all the way to hitting Hezbollah bases, and then at the far end of the 2-week spectrum is declaring an overall war on terror and attacking terrorist sponsors such as Syria. So the idea is they're not going to implement this plan, but an hour later, Reagan's press speaker, Larry Speakes, publicly announces that, and I quote, the president will let diplomacy run its full course before taking further steps, but he is prepared to take whatever actions are necessary. And then the Reagan administration enters a news blackout. The idea is, hopefully they're not going to have to engage in what is probably going to be a military debacle. The idea is to at least use the threat that Reagan will not be like Carter to signal to the others that they're the ones that need to budge. And it winds up working. So the next day, June 25th, Berry announces a plan to free the hostages. There's some more finagling that takes place, but there's movement, sort of a no-deal deal emerges, where Reagan does promise that the U.S. will advocate for the release of the detainees as long as the hostages are released. So with pressure, Assad puts a lot of pressure on the Iranians, on Hezbollah near the end, and on June 30th, the hostages are released. The next day, about half of the detainees are released as well, and Israel will release the rest in subsequent months. So overall, during the TWA hijacking, Reagan and his administration are constantly have the Iran hostage crisis in mind. They are obsessed with the idea that this is going to be what brings down the Reagan administration. And it influences their behavior. At first, it's a moderating factor, but then as the negotiations move on, it does push them to seek military escalation. And in the wake of the hijacking, we do see that Reagan is scarred by what happened, and he's much more willing to put military steps on the table. So in October of that year, when the cruise ship Gil Lauro is hijacked, Reagan and his advisors are constantly discussing military options. That hijacking ends with a U.S. military engagement when U.S. fighter planes intercept the civilian aircraft that the hijackers are on and forces it to land at a NATO base. And then, of course, in December 1985 and April 1986, there are further attacks that the administration traces back to Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and Reagan decides on a military response, Operation El Dorado Canyon. But again, the danger of a hostage-taking sort of causes him to pause. So a lot of the National Security Council is ready in December 1985. Like, let's do this, let's take steps against Gaddafi, but there's again this worry, there are still Americans in Libya. So in January 86, Reagan again says, okay, Americans need to go out. We need to get all possible Americans out of Libya before we can take steps. And that danger of a hostage taking is, again, not insubstantial. So after El Dorado Canyon, Gaddafi doesn't go against the Americans in Libya, but there's a Libyan-affiliated terrorist group, the Abu Nidal group in Lebanon, and they wind up executing 2 American hostages and a British hostage that they have, likely on Gaddafi's orders. So overall, I think the Reagan years are very vital in shaping U.S. counterterrorism. And what I'm hoping to point out is that the Iran hostage crisis has a much more powerful sway over U.S. counterterrorism policies. It isn't something that just happens and then disappears. It is something that policymakers are constantly thinking about as they're crafting counterterrorism policy in the 1980s, both as a moderating factor and later on as an escalating factor as well. So even though Reagan has a lot of rhetoric about being a tough man and fighting terrorism, what we do see is that his administration winds up basing a lot of their decisions on the perceived threat of rogue states and rogue actors. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Silke for organizing this panel, and to Matthew for joining us, and of course Bob for agreeing to chair and read our papers, and to all of you for being here, and the Reagan Foundation. I just wanted to share a personal anecdote because I went to high school in Chatsworth, which is about 10 miles down the Ronald Reagan freeway to the east. But I did a master's degree in history at Cal State Northridge, and I worked with Tom Maddox there. And I don't know if any of you know Tom Maddox, but if you subscribe to H. Diplo, you've probably at least seen his name, because I would venture to guess that he is the longest serving and maybe hardest working editor that H. Diplo has ever had. But I thought that I would get a master's degree in history and teach high school, was the plan. And in my first graduate seminar with Tom Maddox, and I'm gonna date myself here, you'll all know how old I really am. This was back in 2004, he brought his grad seminar here to do research, and it was doing research here in the archives and just reading the documents and seeing, Reagan's like handwritten notes and things on the documents, and it was just so intriguing to me, and that was why I decided to go on and do a PhD. So it's a real treat to be here for this conference, and this place literally changed the entire course and direction of my life. So thank you for indulging my personal reminiscences. I'll talk a little bit about the broader book project that I'm working on right now. So the overarching argument is that the war on drugs was the national security paradigm that both linked and transcended the Cold War and the war on terror. And so this was a national security paradigm that also linked domestic and foreign policy. Foreign policy characterized by militarized intervention, and a domestic policy characterized by criminalization and law enforcement of people and substances. And so the chronological scope of the book is not just looking at the 80s, it's not just looking at the presidential years, but I also look at Reagan's years as governor of California from 1966 to 72. And when we include Reagan's gubernatorial years in the age of Reagan, I think a couple things stand out. One is that, Reagan's 1966 gubernatorial campaign pioneered the politics of law and order, 2 years before Nixon enters the White House. And the other one is that what tends to be described as the Reagan Revolution, I think when you take a longer historical arc, I think I would argue that it's a counter-revolution. And it was a counter-revolution that he was waging, back in his days as governor of California. And so I would say the book sits at the intersection of histories of the war on drugs and Reagan biography, most of which neglects the drug wars, and also tends to focus solely on his presidential years. Lou Cannon, his official biographer, separates out the years as governor from years as president. But even in Lou Cannon's book, Governor Reagan, he doesn't even mention one of the biggest sources of opposition to Reagan's governorship, which was, of course, the Black Panther Party and Black radical activists. And so I see the drug war as part of this broader culture war over domestic dissent. And during Reagan's gubernatorial years, the main dissenters were, of course, African Americans, students, and anti-war activists. So yeah, I would suggest that we consider the age of Reagan over a longer historical arc. He was an opponent of civil rights. And so in Reagan's sort of view of crime, he conflated civil disobedience and crime. So he didn't really see that there was a difference between committing crimes and refusing to abide by laws that were themselves unjust. I don't see what he did as part of a white backlash, which I think is the traditional sort of narrative. But this was not reactive, this was proactive, and he was asserting counterclaims about rights, about whose rights were more important. So this was a period when a series of Supreme Court decisions, including the Miranda decision, had convinced conservatives that that criminals were being mollycoddled, they were being extended too many rights, and what about their victims? The victims are the ones who should be having more rights here. And also, the law-abiding public has the right to live free from fear of becoming a victim of crime. So this is actually a hugely expansive vision of rights and of the state's responsibility to safeguard those rights. So one of the major thematic issues that I'm kind of grappling with as I work on this book manuscript is, to what extent was Reagan following public opinion, and to what extent was he shaping it? And of course, this is, can be seen as a feedback loop, I think. But of course, Jimmy Carter had more or less declared a ceasefire in the war on drugs. Obviously, at the bureaucratic level, of course, State Department and Federal Bureau of Narcotics and later DEA, they're still obviously doing their thing. The drug warriors still exist, right? But at the executive level, Carter himself, openly favored decriminalization of possession of up to an ounce of marijuana. Several states decriminalized marijuana in the 70s. And this kind of led to the growth of the parents' movement, especially around commercial sales and advertising that seemed very aimed toward children. So parents are becoming upset. Reagan in this period is not just sitting there waiting for his turn. He has his radio programs. He's writing and publishing articles. He's very much publicly opposing Jimmy Carter's policies in pretty much every area, but especially with what he deems a permissive attitude toward drugs and drug use. And so when Jimmy Carter's his point man for drug policy, Peter Bourne, who had pioneered a harm reduction approach, right? This was a very realistic view that recognized that drug use and drugs themselves, the actual substances, are not something that we'll ever be able to completely eradicate from society. So what government policy should be aimed at doing is reducing the harms and the social harms caused by drug use and drug addiction. But Peter Bourne was involved in a scandal where he was like at a party sniffing coke, and so the optics of like the drug policy guy doing coke at a party where other Washington like sort of politicos are present, not a good look. That definitely I think enhances this sort of like feeling that this permissiveness has gone too far. Right, so when Reagan comes to power and declares war on drugs, what that federal strategy looks like is for foreign policy, the emphasis is on supply side, so crop eradication, particularly with the use of herbicides. This approach empowered local security forces. So when we look at what's going on in Latin America at this time, particularly in Peru and Colombia and Bolivia as well, the Andean countries where I think they estimated about 90% of the world's cocaine is coming from the coca that's grown in the Andes. And so at this time, FARC in Colombia and some of the other guerrilla groups and Shining Path in Peru are starting to take more of an approach toward like trying to profit from drug sales. So they're moving in Peru, they're moving into the Upper Huallaga Valley, and they're linking up with the coca growers and starting to use the profits from coca sales to fund terrorism. And so, of course, for the Reagan administration, Cuba and the Soviet Union are the ultimate sources of this terrorism, right? Because they're the ones funding these leftist guerrilla insurgencies in Latin America. And so, of course, Haig famously argued for like going to the source, right? And let's just invade Cuba. Like, let's just get it over with. But so this is the context in which the rise of the rhetoric of narco-terrorism emerges. And so initially this rhetoric was kind of wielded against Cuba and Nicaragua, the Marxist-Leninist regimes. There were like a series of congressional hearings about Cuban and Nicaraguan involvement in drug trafficking, and the administration contended that this was very much pursued as a matter of policy in order to undermine American society by like turning everyone into drug addicts. The evidence of Cuban and Sandinista complicity in drug trafficking was, evidence did emerge that there were some corrupt officials involved, but no evidence ever emerged that this was pursued as, official policy or that it was, systemic by any means. Of course, claims were very similar to the claims that were made about the Contra involvement in drug trafficking, right? So and those claims were certainly known to CIA, but Reagan's, pledge to hold the Contras together body and soul meant that the administration essentially turned a blind eye to known evidence of Contras smuggling cocaine into the United States. This blew up later in the 90s with I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but he's the one who broke the story of the CIA-Contra connection in the San Jose Mercury News. Gary Webb, right. He later committed suicide by shooting himself twice in the back of the head. Not really sure how that's possible, but I don't know, it could be, maybe. Anyway, so in 1985, one of the leftist guerrilla groups in Colombia, M19, seized the Colombian Palace of Justice. They take the entire Colombian Supreme Court hostage. They seize documents, including extradition requests, one of which was for Pablo Escobar. So allegations emerged that Pablo Escobar had paid M19 guerrillas like almost $1 million for this attack. And so it was in this context that the 1986 National Security Decision Directive 221 declared drugs as a national security threat. And so I'll just quote from that National Security Decision Directive. It was aimed specifically at, quote, those nations with a flourishing narcotics industry where a combination of international criminal trafficking organizations, rural insurgents, and urban terrorists can undermine the stability of the local government, corrupt efforts to curb drug crop production, processing, and distribution, and distort public perceptions of the narcotics issue in such a way that it becomes part of an anti-U.S. or anti-Western debate. But so this was the first official linkage of counterinsurgency and counter-narcotics in U.S. policy. And it authorized wider military involvement in the drug war. DOD pushed back on this and argued that focusing on the drug wars detracted from military preparedness, and the focus, of course, is still Russia at this point, right? The Soviet Union. So there's a big push from Congress to militarize the drug wars. It wasn't until the end of the Cold War and Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney is the one who really embraced the mission. So DOD, military, we're going to fight the war on drugs now. And so I would argue that this is partly, the search for for a mission in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I argue that this rhetoric of narco-terrorism is problematic because it conflates the means and ends of very different actors. So narco-terrorism was used to designate three distinct phenomena. One was the use of terror by drug traffickers to intimidate politicians and government. The other was the use of drug profits by leftist insurgents, specifically leftist, right? Not the Contras. The Contras were not narco-terrorists. So the use of drug profits by leftist insurgents to finance terrorism aimed at outcomes that were completely unrelated to drugs, but also then the logistical network through which drugs and drug profits flowed. So I argue that this conflation of threats allowed the administration to skirt post-Vietnam restrictions on counterinsurgency aid by designating it counter-narcotics. And Latin American officials were, they used this rhetoric as well. In fact, the earliest reference I could find to narco-terrorism was actually from Peruvian President Betancourt. And so they're using this rhetoric as well. I mean, for them, it's a very real threat, right? I mean, they're battling existential threats to their governments. But counter-narcotics and counterinsurgency policies frequently worked at cross purposes. So the focus on crop eradication destroyed the livelihoods of peasant growers, which essentially had the effect of driving them into the arms of the insurgent groups who were offering them protection. It also enhanced the appeal of insurgent ideology that equated local security forces with U.S. imperialism. So meanwhile, on the domestic front, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, of course, notorious for the extreme disparity in penalties for crack versus powder cocaine. Also militarization of domestic law enforcement, the rise of SWAT, the spread of asset forfeiture laws, which very much invest law enforcement in prolonging the drug wars by making their resources contingent upon the assets that they're seizing. So from this perspective, one of the questions of this conference is when does the age of Reagan end? And if I recall correctly, I think Sean Willents argues that it's in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. I think we heard the other night that in 2016 with the election of Trump, the Reagan era has ended. So I would suggest that from this perspective of the drug wars, the age of Reagan is not over. And you may say well, but what about all these states that are legalizing marijuana? And even some states have legalized hallucinogenic drugs. What about that? That's true, but we saw in the 70s as well, a number of states decriminalized and later recriminalized. Marijuana continues to be a Schedule I narcotic at the federal level. There's also currently, the latest chapter in the drug wars, the fentanyl scare, complete with a menacing foreign enemy, China, and of course, mass incarceration. The United States incarcerates a higher percentage of its population than any other nation on earth. So from this perspective, I would say the age of Reagan certainly has not ended. I think what is perhaps most important is that the drug wars inured the American public to the logic of the forever war, the endless wars against a strategically ambiguous enemy. Thank you.
Well, thanks for three really interesting papers. There's a set of common concerns that run through each of their papers, although each is quite distinctive in its own right. The issue of terrorism and especially hostage taking, the interrelated issue of rogue states, and also narco-terrorism. There are common themes that emerge here too, the theme being that a new kind of national security threat is beginning to emerge during the decade of the 1980s, and that national security threat is related to this nexus between drug trafficking, hostage taking, episodes of terrorism, state support of terrorism, and so-called rogue states. The papers also display a number of similar strengths. There's an effective use of new documentation, especially from the archives right here at the Reagan Library. There's a clarity and a brisk-paced narrative in all three of the papers, which made them a pleasure to read. And these are intrinsically interesting, fascinating even, case studies that display some of the dilemmas that the Reagan administration faced in the non-Cold War dimensions of the foreign policy threats that were beginning to emerge. The issue of national security is one that I think could bear more careful examination, because after all, national security means something very concrete when we look at American foreign policy in the long arc from the 1930s and the lead up to World War II, throughout the Cold War and into the end of the 1980s. I think it's been pretty well established that American officials from the FDR administration right through the Reagan administration and the administration of the elder George Bush thought in terms of correlations of power, thought in terms of threats being embodied in states that might pose a threat to the physical safety of the United States if they were to gain control over a sufficient amount of industrial infrastructure, of key territories, of advanced technology, of skilled workforces. I mean, this is the terrain that scholars like Mel Leffler have plowed over the past several decades, and most studies have certainly borne out the validity of that framework which guided U.S. policy. Now, to make an intervention in the literature on national security, I think it becomes incumbent on any scholar to really contend with that understanding of national security and how it begins to shift. Now, the argument has certainly been made that in the wake of 9/11, a very new framework of national security emerged because the American homeland was attacked, which was not expected, as everyone who lived through that knows. It was a shock to the system and individual psyches. That was not expected. And when Matt talks about how Reagan, and I really like the way he puts it, he says that Reagan began to adapt to the process of a new threat that would shape the global order of the post-Reagan order. I think that's true, but I also think that the kind of threat that was emerging in the 1980s, the TWA hijacking, the seizure of the judicial building in Bogota, hostage taking, was dramatically different from what we think about when in the so-called age of terror, if we're still even using that term, if that is at all relevant. But certainly I think it's important to think about the differences between the kind of threats that emerge during the period of the early and mid-1980s and the kinds of terrorist threat that emerges in the wake of 9/11, at least the perception of a national security threat. So I'd ask all three authors as they develop these papers more fully into the book projects that they will be a part of, to think through some of the complexities of what national security actually means and how does it evolve in the period from the 1980s into the early post-Cold War era. What is prominent in all three of these papers is the dimension of politics. So we're not just looking at a national security threat in the way that, say, the Truman administration viewed the need to forge NATO, the need to provide massive rehabilitation aid to Western Europe, the fear of a Soviet threat to the Eastern Mediterranean. Instead, we're looking at something which intersects very much with political optics, and hence the point that Silke made in her paper about the intense focus on polling data during the unfolding of the TWA crisis. I would suggest, just being a devil's advocate, that this isn't a national security threat. It's a foreign policy challenge, and it's a political challenge / opportunity. And I think we diminish the meaning of the term national security if we conflate this, because clearly this was a political issue viewed in the wake of the political disaster for Reagan's predecessor, Jimmy Carter, that occurred as a result of his mishandling of the Iranian hostage crisis. Reagan was not fixated, as George W. Bush later would be, on threats to the physical safety of the American homeland. He was fixated on his popularity and maintaining an image as a vigorous, hyper-masculine, tough-minded chief executive who is going to dramatically differentiate himself from the weakling Jimmy Carter. So I would submit that's less a national security threat than a political challenge for a political leader. Just a couple other brief comments, and then I'd love to open it up to the audience. I think more of a historiographical engagement would be helpful in each of these papers. The basic question I think that should be asked is, what scholars are you entering into a conversation with? Who has previously written about this? Are you challenging them? Are you agreeing with them? Are you adding a new interpretation? You're using new primary sources, but none of you are the first people to write about this issue. And granted, this is a very short conference paper and just an overview, but as the papers are developed further, I think that historiographical engagement is critical. If any of these papers were to be submitted to a professional journal, it's the first thing a reviewer would say. Okay, well, who are you talking to here? What are you saying that's new? What's original here? Who do you agree with? Who do you disagree with? Because you're not reinventing the wheel here. People have written about the shadow of the Iranian hostage crisis. People have written about the TWA hijacking. People have written about narcotics trafficking, and yet there are very few secondary works cited in any of the paper. And then just a final point to focus on the broader themes of this conference as a whole, and that is, what do these papers matter more broadly to the study of the Reagan administration and to the wider literature on the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan. So thanks again for excellent papers, which were a great starting point for my thinking through about some of these issues. And now let's just open it up to questions from the audience. Yeah.
Michelle, at one point in your presentation, you mentioned this implicit promise to the American people to be free from fear of crime or threats to their physical safety in their homeland. And one of the themes of this conference that we talked about is connections back to Roosevelt. And so one of the thoughts I had was the promise of freedom from fear warranted the exercise of tremendous amounts of American power on the world stage during World War II. Is there some sort of connection you might be able to see between the Reagan administration and its policy in Latin America and anti-drug policy and the Roosevelt administration rhetorically or within administration discourse? I didn't know if you'd come across anything like that. And then for Matthew, I enjoyed especially the quote you had from Schultz about, what was it? Iraq was an enemy of the world community or something to that effect. And that struck me. From my own research, I found some archival evidence within intelligence and military circles of a hope to draw Iraq into U.S. military defense orbit and perhaps convert Saddam's regime into a client state. I was wondering if you came across any sort of tensions. Is this a story of one track of the federal government having one vision and another track of the federal government having a different one? How do you sort of resolve these different tensions in understanding Iraqi strategies to tame rogue states rather than perhaps confront them?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. It's not something that I've thought that much about, but I mean, Reagan was an ardent, like, FDR, fan. Like, he styled himself, after Roosevelt. He had enormous respect for FDR. And so I would just point out the sort of dramatically different international environments that both of them were operating in, right? I mean, for Roosevelt, freedom from fear is part of, the democratic way of life against the totalitarian threat of Nazi Germany, which, is a very, like, real and urgent and existential, security threat, global security threat. I don't think that that Reagan is facing anything that dramatic. Crime rate. So I think this is where I would talk about, like, the way that we conceive of crime and how crime is defined, because we don't. When I say, like, the word crime, I think what most people would imagine is some sort of, like, violent street crime. And not like what we would call, like, white collar or, like, corporate crimes, right? Which I would argue have a much wider negative impact on people's lives, the lives of people who are not, elite, and who can't, afford, like, all of the protections that society offers when you have money, right? And so during the 60s, it's really hard actually to look at, like, crime rates because they're so wrapped up in certain definitions of crime. And because Reagan and other conservatives are conflating civil disobedience with street crime, it's really hard to see, like, well, what's the actual, like, percentage of, like, violent crimes that are, what we would consider violent crimes versus, like, protests movements, which I don't think, I mean, I don't know if anybody in this room would, like, identify that as crime, but Reagan and other conservatives certainly did. So what they're seeing in the, in the 60s and early 70s is, crime, it's out of control, it's getting out of control. But even, like, during the 80s, even during the crack, the media engineered crack hysteria, which is, like, a crime theme, right? And so, like, when when mainstream media and journalists are like what stories are we going to cover, there are like these themes that tend to be all encompassing, and if that story doesn't fit into whatever like the theme of the day is, then we just don't cover it. And so to a certain extent, these crime waves are manufactured by the media. And so crime rates are actually declining even during the media engineered like crack hysteria. That was a really long and rambling answer that probably didn't even answer your question, so sorry about that.
Well, I appreciate your question about the debates about how to deal with Iraq after the end of the Iran-Iraq war. And I think it's the period between the ceasefire in August of '88 until George Bush takes office is a really important one for Iraq policy, but also a very tangled one. And I've come across some mixed messaging as well. In my broader project, I discussed that in addition to chemical weapons, which was the prime driver of the Reagan administration starting to reevaluate their views of Iraq, there's also the Stark incident, which on all official discussions, this is at the very beginning of the American reflagging of Kuwaiti oil tankers during the Iran-Iraq war, and an Iraqi plane launches an attack on an American tanker, kills a lot of sailors, and all of the official discussions are it's an accident, and the Americans are very happy to accept that explanation because they're more worried about Iran at this point. But it keeps happening, and the Iraqi planes harass American ships. There's no incident that's as devastating as the Stark incident, but Reagan writes in his diary, he says, we just don't know whether they don't know what they're doing or whether there's more going on here, and so we're sending people over to find out. And then a few months later writes the same thing after another incident. And so it's all of these frustrations, and then of course the chemical attacks on the Kurds that prompts Schultz in particular to start thinking of Iraq as a bad guy. But at the same time, there's other people in the administration who say, no, at the end of the war, he's going to moderate his behavior, he can become a partner, and that's the rationale that George Bush and his team act on at the beginning of their time in office. And if you read their memoirs, they say, oh, well, that's what Reagan's policy was, we just continued that. But in Schultz's memoirs and several other places, I have found signs that at least the State Department was thinking about reevaluating, but chose not to take significant action because of the transition. Unfortunately, the documentary sources just aren't out there right now in the Reagan Library during that critical transition period. There's a few other issues I would love to, find the sources from that '88 time period. But as far as I can tell at the moment, there was significant debate at the very least about changing Iraq policy, but that got lost in the translation to the new administration.
So first of all, these were fantastic papers. Thank you so much for them. I think you all three pretty convincingly show that because the sort of era of counterterrorism is emerging during the Cold War ideas are shaping what counterterrorism and what definitions of terrorism look like. And I'm just curious if, as the Cold War ends and after the Cold War ends, does something begin to shift in the way that policymakers are thinking about terrorism and counterterrorism, or is there something kind of baked in because these ideas about terrorism are emerging during the Cold War, that the Cold War continues to shape how policymakers think about terrorism and counterterrorism even after the Cold War is over?
If I could start, I think counterterrorism is inherently reactive. So most policies will be made against specific attacks. So I think one thing that is set up that continues is this very idea of illegitimacy, of criminality, that the things that are happening are not things that should be part of the normal political discourse. You do not use terrorism to achieve your political ends. That being said, I think there's a shift that starts a little bit in the 80s but gets even more prominent during the 90s, that there's much more of a focus on Islamism and sort of religiously inspired terrorism on suicide terrorism. So on top of that inherent criminality comes the idea that there's also an irrationality. And I think that there's much more of a focus on that after the end of the Cold War. Whereas during the Cold War, there's much more of a, these are rational choices that are being used to undermine the United States and Western democratic societies. I mean, Reagan and his co-conservatives are very clear this is an inherent threat to Western democracy by people who are just not willing or capable of adhering to the legal rules that have been set up. So I think, love to hear what you think.
Yeah, so I would say that Reagan, when he came into office, felt that terrorism was very connected with the Cold War threat. That the Soviets were underneath a lot of terrorism. And I think on one hand that view in scholarship is perhaps a little too quickly dismissed. But on the other hand, the Reagan administration certainly overplayed that. And I think by the middle of the decade, in the period that Silke has been discussing, and by the time of the bombing of Libya in 1986, I think that Reagan had largely shaked loose of the idea that the Soviets were behind all of the terrorism in the Middle East. And part of what I found is that Reagan was much more flexible over the course of his presidency on that kind of thing. He learned on the job that no, the Soviets, the Cold War wasn't behind all of these types of percolating threats, and he was willing to adapt to that, not always perfectly, of course. But I think I also found that Reagan's counterterrorism strategy that at least I argue was reached its high point with the bombing of Libya in 1986, became derailed, particularly with Iran-Contra, when a lot of the key architects of that strategy, including Oliver North, were no longer in the administration. And I came across a fascinating memcon of an NSC meeting where Frank Carlucci, who replaces John Poindexter after Iran-Contra, has a long monologue where he says, no, terrorism is not an act of war, it's just a matter of criminal law enforcement, which is exactly what Reagan had spent so much time building a strategy against. And interestingly, even though George Bush played a huge role in crafting in 85, 86, the Reagan administration's counterterrorism strategies, very involved in that. When he becomes president, he doesn't necessarily keep that in place. And so I think that there is some disconnect at the end of the Cold War, also with so many other international issues going on.
Any more questions?
Yeah, a quick question for Silke. Between the Iran hostage crisis, the Lebanon hostage takings, the JBA hijacking, Eshomaro, and basically every one of these major terrorist incidents that came up in your talk, the common thread is not just the United States being involved, but Israel being involved. And you mentioned, of course, demands from terrorists to release hostages in Israel, but virtually every one of the groups involved with these is just inherently dead set against Zionism, inherently dead set against Israel, and their demands almost always involve Israeli concessions, which they're taking American hostages to push for. Did you find in your research, any of these primary source documents, sort of the Reagan administration's conception of this part of this dynamic, this idea that every single one of these issues we're facing is actually not because of us per se, it's because of our connection to an ally who by proxy they're attacking us due to? Like, is this something that kept coming up, or did they just sort of ignore that and dealt with the issue on the ground?
I haven't seen anything. I will admit I don't have access to as many sources as I would like. So it's possible that it's out there. I haven't seen anything yet. There's an inherent feeling in the Reagan administration that these are Americans, that they were taken hostage because they are American. But of course, I mean, we see it in 1969 already that the Israelis have beefed up their aviation security, for example, to the point that it's just much easier to attack American targets instead of Israeli ones. So I haven't found the documentary evidence of that yet. I will keep looking.
Yes.
Hi, Ben Engel from Seoul National University. I guess this question would be for all of you, but maybe most related to Matthew's work. I was wondering if any of you had come across any, in the discussions about rogue states, anything about North Korea. Today it's our quintessential rogue state, right? And in the 1980s, it's not a sponsor of terrorism, it's more like a terrorist state, right? The 1983 bombing in Yangon that took out several members of the South Korean cabinet, the downing of, not the Soviet shoot down of a Cal airliner, but the bombing of a Cal airliner several years later. And also during this period, the United States starts to figure out through satellite imagery that North Korea is developing its nuclear weapons, although they don't come out and say it until the 1990s, but the Reagan administration figures this out. So I was wondering, and this is kind of related to a previous question, whether the Cold War structure prevented the United States from recognizing North Korea as a rogue state and rather a member of this communist bloc, so it was defined differently during this time, or whether they were starting to see North Korea as one of these rogue states like Libya or other places. Thank you.
I guess I can start us off, and I don't spend too much time looking at North Korea in the research I've done so far, mainly because I found that it did not figure very highly in the emerging debates among Reagan and his team about this idea of outlaw states. They rarely mention North Korea, which is curious because, as you say, they were rising to that surface. And I think that one reason would be the Cold War and the communism angle, but also perhaps the fact that the North Korea's attacks and sponsorship involved Americans less, and therefore drew in the Reagan administration less frequently. But that said, I think that my project goes through the Gulf War, and then I think that the 1993 war scare with North Korea under the Clinton administration is another critical episode in the solidification of this idea of rogue states as critical to American national security at the end of the Cold War, and that's an incident that I look forward to delving more deeply into in my research as it takes more center stage in the 90s.
Maybe if I could add to that, I'm not quite sure because I haven't done too much on North Korea either, but my feeling is that Reagan is going after states that he thinks the US is actually gonna have leverage against. So Gaddafi is like that perfect trilogy, right? He's a leader of a decolonized state, he's a leader of a Middle Eastern state, and he's a Soviet friend, but not an ally, which makes him so attractive. So I'm not sure if there was a sentiment, I'm just speculating here, that maybe there wasn't the US leverage that Reagan could have brought to bear against North Korea in the way that he could have brought leverage against Libya, for example.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you so much to the three of you. And following on these things about Cold War and how it intersects with these questions. So for Matt and Selka, do you have any idea on how the Soviet Union perceived these rogue activities, and did they leverage them or try to curb them, or see that as a thorn on their side with these states that are perceived to be in their sphere acting like this? And for Michelle, so how did the Cold War lens color the perception of the realities on the ground? For example, right-wing paramilitary groups engaging the drug trade to not fitting into these leftist narco paradigm, and did they choose to just ignore it, or did they actually grapple with the complexity of how the drug trade permeated both sides of these civil conflicts? Thank you.
So yeah, great question. I think this does kind of touch on Nicole's previous question about counterterrorism versus anti-communism, and it's something that I'm really trying to work through right now because Cuba and Nicaragua, of course, and the Soviet Union, of course. I mean, they're just constantly referred to as terrorist states, but they're not treated as terrorist states sort of administratively or bureaucratically. Everything that's labeled terrorism is all Middle East, you know what I mean? So it seems like even though the rhetoric is very much that, yeah, these communist states are definitely terrorists, they always have been, that it's like this rhetorical kind of catch-all, but then when the rubber meets the road, they're treated as sort of distinct threats. And so I would just say, yeah, it's obviously not just leftist insurgent groups that are, dealing in narcotics, right? It's right-wing insurgent groups as well, like the Contras and like others. The Reagan administration does not recognize that. right? They just completely ignore it. You know, Reagan's like critics. I mean, John Kerry like chairs a subcommittee in I think 1986 to explore these allegations, and the subcommittee like reaches the conclusion that these the allegations were received and ignored basically, and that was a full decade before the CIA Inspector General does their own. Their IG report says the same thing essentially. Like, CIA had knowledge of this and basically chose not to do anything about it. So even though the war on drugs was a very bipartisan consensus, that bipartisan consensus fell apart when it came to like which groups are we actually like tagging as narco-terrorists, and what are we actually gonna do about it? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I'll just say real quick, there's some access to Soviet ideas through the East German archives. So the impression that I get, and I don't know if it's yours, is that for the Soviets, like the Americans, terrorism is a second-tier issue. So as long as it doesn't disrupt anything, they're okay with letting it run. But then when you do have these huge crises that might push the US to engage militarily in Lebanon, the Soviets do say, are sort of pushing their allies to sort of calm down. So Assad goes to Moscow for a regularly scheduled visit in the middle of the TWA crisis, and we do think that the Soviets were like, hey, calm this down. Let's not get crazy here. That's my impression, at least.
I get the sense that by the end of the 1980s, the Soviets had their attention elsewhere. A lot of these states, particularly Libya and Iraq, had been allies or clients of the Soviet Union, and so I get the sense that if anything, Gorbachev and the Soviets see it as a way to kind of needle Reagan a little bit in terms of critiquing any aggressive American responses and so on, but seem to have less of a dog in the fight on the issues of rogue states, at least in the public eye.
Well, please join me in that thanking.